Many people confuse the dark night of the soul with a psychological illness. But as Carl Jung often emphasized, what looks like madness on the surface may be the very beginning of transformation. Let us walk through the deeper truth, step by step. The collapse of the old self. The first sign of spiritual awakening often feels indistinguishable from depression. The collapse of the life you once knew. Your values, desires, ambitions, and attachments fall apart like a house made of sand. In depression, this collapse feels like a meaningless tragedy. The person looks at the ruins of their old identity and finds no foundation on which to stand. The emptiness consumes them. But in awakening, the collapse carries a hidden intelligence. It is the psyche itself dismantling the false structures of the ego. Carl Jung described the ego as a small light flickering within the vastness of the unconscious. For years, perhaps decades, this fragile light tries to control reality, building walls of ambition, relationships, and beliefs to protect itself. But when the self, the deeper center of the psyche, stirs, the walls must fall. The ego feels terror. It says, "I am dying. I am nothing. My life is meaningless." Yet what is truly dying is not the self, but the mask. Awakening is the breakdown of illusion, the crumbling of the story you mistook for your soul. Depression leaves you stranded in rubble. Awakening teaches you to see the rubble as the soil for rebirth. Loss of interest or loss of illusion, both depression and awakening rob you of interest in life. Music feels dull, hobbies lose their spark, relationships seem hollow. The outer world, once colorful, appears gray. In depression, this loss of interest is a collapse of vitality. The psyche no longer feeds energy into life, leaving you numb and disconnected. But in awakening, the loss of interest is the psyche's way of withdrawing energy from illusions. You no longer find joy in what once entertained you, not because you are broken, but because your soul refuses to be satisfied with substitutes for truth. Jung taught that libido, psychic energy, is not destroyed, but redirected. In awakening, the energy once spent on chasing pleasures, status, or distractions retreats inward, preparing for transformation. It feels like death, but it is gestation. The danger lies in misinterpretation. If you mistake this withdrawal for depression, you may medicate, distract, or numb yourself back into illusion. But if you see it as initiation, you realize the emptiness is the space in which new meaning can be born. Depression numbs you. Awakening awakens you to the emptiness of illusion. The shadow emerges. Perhaps the most terrifying similarity between awakening and depression is the sudden confrontation with darkness. Nightmares, fears, guilt, and old traumas rise to the surface. You feel haunted by memories and impulses you thought were buried. In depression, this shadow takes the form of relentless self-criticism and hopelessness. The mind attacks itself, whispering, "You are worthless. You will never change." But in awakening, the shadow is not an enemy. It is the teacher. It is the repressed part of your psyche demanding to be integrated. Jung warned, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The shadow's emergence in awakening is not punishment. It is purification. The unconscious surfaces so that it may be faced, understood, and transformed. The difference is subtle but crucial. Depression drowns you in shadow without meaning. Awakening confronts you with shadow for the sake of wholeness. The same pain, but one imprisons while the other initiates. Isolation is initiation. Both depression and awakening bring isolation. Friends drift away, family feels distant, conversations lose their warmth. You feel like a stranger in your own life. In depression, isolation feels like abandonment. The world rejects you, and you spiral into loneliness. But in awakening, isolation is a necessary silence. The psyche withdraws from the noise of society so that the deeper voice of the self can be heard. Mystics throughout history retreated into deserts, forests, or caves, not out of despair but to hear the unconscious speak. Awakening places you in solitude because transformation requires separation. The old identity cannot survive in the crowd. It dissolves in silence. This silence is not absence. It is initiation. You are not cut off from the world. You are being prepared to re-enter it with new vision. Depression imprisons you in loneliness. Awakening teaches you that solitude is the furnace in which the soul is reshaped. Ego death versus identity. Crisis. At the heart of both depression and awakening lies the same terrifying experience, the loss of self. Depression whispers, "You are losing yourself," and there is nothing left to replace it. The ego collapses, and with it, all sense of meaning and direction. The person feels erased, hollowed out, abandoned by life itself. Awakening, too, shatters the ego. But here lies the sacred difference. Ego death is not annihilation, but revelation. When the ego dies, what emerges is not emptiness, but the self. The deeper center of consciousness that Jung described as the true totality of the psyche. The ego is like a mask worn for survival. It believes itself to be the whole face. When awakening rips the mask away, the ego panics. I am gone. I am nothing. But behind the mask lies the face of the eternal self, the image of God within. In depression, the death of ego feels like meaninglessness. In awakening, the death of ego reveals the ground of meaning. Both are painful, both are disorienting, but one leads to despair, the other to liberation. This is why so many confuse awakening with mental illness. The symptoms are identical: loss of interest, collapse of identity, isolation, confrontation with shadow. But the direction differs. Depression spirals downward into stagnation. Awakening spirals inward toward transformation. Ego death is the threshold. If you cling to the ego, the experience becomes unbearable despair. If you surrender, it becomes the doorway to eternity. Closing reflection on points: the collapse, the emptiness, the shadow, the silence, the death of ego. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of transformation. Depression and awakening walk the same path in appearance, but their destination is different. One ends in nothingness. The other in the self. Carl Jung saw suffering not as a curse, but as a summons. The psyche demands growth through pain. Whether you interpret your suffering as punishment or as initiation decides whether you fall into depression or awaken into wholeness. The crisis of meaning. At the root of both depression and awakening lies a devastating crisis of meaning. Depression whispers, "Nothing matters." Life feels stripped of significance. Goals appear hollow, relationships shallow, achievements pointless. The very fabric of existence collapses into absurdity. The person wakes each day wondering why they should continue at all. Awakening also whispers, "What you thought mattered does not." But the tone is different. Where depression erases meaning, awakening deconstructs false meaning. The career, the possessions, the social approval, these once seemed vital, but now feel empty because the soul refuses to feed on shadows. Carl Jung observed that modern people often suffer not from physical illness, but from the loss of meaning. He understood that the psyche cannot live without myth, without a living connection to something greater. Depression is the starvation of the soul. Awakening, though equally painful, is the preparation for a new myth, one born not of society's illusions, but of the deeper self. Thus, what feels like despair may actually be the breaking of false idols. The soul clears the stage so that a truer drama can begin. Depression halts you at the void. Awakening invites you to cross it. The body's cry. Depression weighs heavily on the body. Fatigue sets in. Limbs feel like lead. Sleep becomes both refuge and torment. The body reflects the psyche's paralysis, manifesting numbness, aches, and inertia. The body becomes a prison. Awakening also shakes the body plan, but in a different way. Strange energies surge, trembling, heat in the spine, pressure in the head, heart palpitations, restlessness. The body becomes a battlefield where old patterns are burned away and new currents flow. To the rational mind, both appear as illness. But Jung knew the psyche speaks through the body. Depression is the body echoing despair. Awakening is the body struggling to adapt to the influx of unconscious energy. Both are cries from the depths, demanding attention. If ignored, depression deepens and awakening turns chaotic. But if understood, the body's cry can guide healing. The heaviness of depression calls for renewal. The intensity of awakening calls for grounding. Both experiences are invitations to listen to the wisdom beneath the symptoms. Despair or divine discontent. Depression suffocates you in despair. It convinces you that joy is gone forever, that nothing can restore light to your existence. Despair paralyzes the will and chains you to hopelessness. Awakening, too, unsettles you, but with what mystics have called divine discontent. Even pleasures that once satisfied now leave you empty. Success, recognition, even love feel insufficient. Something deeper, beyond the material, calls to you. This hunger is painful. It can feel like depression because nothing external soothes it. Yet it is not despair. It is the soul's demand for truth. The discontent is divine because it refuses to let you settle for less than reality itself. Jung believed that this hunger for wholeness is the driving force of individuation. While depression chains you to despair, awakening compels you to seek the eternal. One suffocates, the other unsettles so that you may evolve. Breakdown or breakthrough. Every crisis carries a dual possibility, to destroy or to transform. Depression often manifests as breakdown without breakthrough. The psyche collapses into itself, spinning in cycles of despair. The energy that could transform becomes locked in stagnation. Awakening, too, is a breakdown, but with the possibility of breakthrough. When illusions shatter, when the ego falls, when meaning dissolves, the psyche stands at a threshold. If endured with courage, the collapse becomes initiation. Jung saw neurosis not simply as pathology, but as a call to deeper life. He wrote that suffering is often the attempt of the self-regulating psyche to restore balance. Depression is the call ignored, resisted, or misinterpreted. Awakening is the same call accepted, endured, and ultimately integrated. Thus, the same breakdown can end in ruin or rebirth. The deciding factor is whether you see suffering as meaningless tragedy or as sacred transformation. Transformation or stagnation. In the end, the path divides here. Transformation or stagnation. Depression without meaning is stagnation. It freezes the soul in endless repetition. The same thoughts, the same pain, the same paralysis. Life becomes a circle of despair with no exit. Awakening through suffering, however, is transformation. The old self dies, but something greater takes its place. This is the process Jung called individuation, the realization of the self, the union of conscious and unconscious, the birth of wholeness. The fire that burns the ego is the same fire that reveals the soul. The silence that isolates you is the same silence in which the self speaks. The despair that breaks you is the same despair that clears the way for rebirth. The difference lies not in the symptoms, but in the interpretation. Depression tells you, this is the end. Awakening tells you, this is the beginning disguised as the end. Why nothing excites you after awakening one. Of the most confusing and painful experiences after spiritual awakening is the sudden loss of excitement. The hobbies that once thrilled you, the ambitions that once gave you fire, the relationships that once consumed you, all seem strangely hollow. Many mistake this for depression, and on the surface it feels the same. But in truth, it is a sign of deep transformation. Carl Jung would say that your libido, your psychic energy, has withdrawn from external objects. For years, that energy fueled desires, goals, and distractions that kept you entangled in the illusions of society. Awakening strips those illusions bare. The psyche refuses to feed on what no longer nourishes the soul. This loss of excitement is not the absence of life, but the redirection of life. It is the pause before rebirth. The self, the deeper center of the psyche, is calling you inward, demanding silence, reflection, and integration. Until you adjust to this new center, the world feels colorless. The danger is in misinterpreting this stage. If you assume you are broken, you may spiral into despair. But if you see it as a necessary withdrawal, you recognize the wisdom behind it. You are being weaned from false fires so that you can discover the eternal flame within. Nothing excites you because you are being prepared for what truly matters. Reflection. So we return to the question, is it spiritual awakening or depression? The truth is that they often wear the same mask. Both strip life of meaning. Both silence your passions. Both confront you with shadow, isolation, and ego death. To the untrained eye, they are identical, but Carl Jung teaches us to look deeper. Depression is stagnation. Awakening is transformation. Depression collapses into nothingness. Awakening collapses into eternity. Depression suffocates. Awakening initiates. Yet, and here lies the paradox, many awakenings begin in depression. What psychiatry calls illness may, in some cases, be the soul's revolt against a life that no longer serves truth. What appears as despair may be the self calling you to step beyond the ego. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. To awaken is to suffer, but to suffer with meaning." Depression strips life of purpose. Awakening strips illusion so that true purpose can be born. So when you find yourself at the edge, ask, is this my end or my beginning? If you dare to endure, if you dare to listen, despair itself may reveal its hidden face, and you will see that what looked like death was, in fact, rebirth.